As we talk about beef cattle markets and our 2022 situation and 2023 outlook, there's a lot of tie-in on some of the other topics that we've already talked about through the week that really help make us understand that full picture. To start out with the day, we'll go through supply, demand, and then we'll give a price outlook. I think the very first thing that we need to talk about in terms of supply is where we sit through 2022 as of now in beef production versus cattle inventory. And that red line of production has diverged and continues to increase, even though we are having contraction, even though we're having tighter inventories. And we hear this conversation a lot about needing to be a sustainable industry. And I think that this really tells that story of the beef industry is finding ways to do more with less. A lot of that is due to higher average weights on the process side, but still the story is the same. We're finding ways to improve production with less inventory. And that less inventory and continued contraction really is the story of supply for the next coming years. Major indicator of what's causing that is input prices. We heard from Norm yesterday in the grain outlook about higher prices, some all-time high corn prices, and really an expectation that we're going to be a little higher than that 5-year average moving forward. That means higher feed costs as you think about cattle that have to be carried and held and being placed on feed and how long it takes them to get there. We have that increased input cost into making those cattle get to the right weight. We heard from Reed about hay. We know that in 22, we have a recent year low supply situation with hay. We're expecting it to be a little bit better in 23, but still hay supply is tight, which is why we're seeing some crazy, way above normal prices for the 22-23 crop. We saw some high prices in 21-22. If you look at the national average of 280 a ton, I think there's times during the last year that several of you on this call would have called me and asked where you could get it for 280 a ton. Other hay, looking at the grass hays and things, again, Reed did a nice job talking through this yesterday. We are seeing some significantly high hay prices. Altogether, corn, hay, and other related feedstuffs, anytime that those animals are in a feed situation and not out on pasture and range, we are having extremely high prices. There are also higher prices being seen if you have private pasture, private range. I heard last week from some folks that we had in town from the Tri-Cities area of private pasture going for as much as $50 an AUM, which is well above what we've seen in historic years. The other thing that we're seeing drive supply downward, which we talked about on Tuesday, is drought. And when you look at that drought chart, pulled this straight off of drought.gov, talks about 31.1 million beef cattle experiencing drought. And I want you to look real close at where that drought is in California, in Texas Panhandle, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska. And then you take that drought chart, you think about the fact that we're still probably looking at another year of La Nina, hopefully a moderating drought. If we have as much drought as we did this last year, could see catastrophic levels of contraction. I don't think anyone's predicting that at this point, but it's something to keep an eye on. And you look at where the beef cattle are in this country. Of the 30 million beef cattle in the US as of January 1 of 22, they are in those drought regions. So we have cattle in Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, California that are seeing some severe drought. That has led to, over the course of the last year, extremely high beef cow slaughter. We saw high beef cow slaughter in 21, even higher slaughter in 22, well above the 5-year average, which is the red line there. We expect that this higher beef cow slaughter is going to down the road lead to some changes in cattle on feed. We're still working through heavy placements. You can see the 22 line is just barely at this point in the year at September crossed over, has been below where we were in 21, still above average on the number of cattle we have on feed. Expect those supplies to be tight moving forward. We know that there's less cows out there. It takes a long time for that calf to reach the feed yard. And so when we see them get there, as we see this cattle on feed number get lower and ultimately expect it to go start being below that long-term average, that's when we can tell that contraction's really in full swing. Something that's keeping that cattle on feed number high now is that we're placing cattle on feed lighter. If you look at the 2022 line on this cattle placed weighing less than 700 pounds, we saw in the summer months, May, June, July, August 2022, we were placing more animals on feed during those months than we did in 21. July and August, even more than the 5-year average. So we're seeing, even though we know there's less cows out there, we're placing more lightweight animals than typical on feed, which means those animals are going to be on feed longer, show up on that report longer, and take longer to get to the finish line. As you'd expect on the inverse side, we're seeing less heavyweight cattle. We just don't know if those animals were out there this year. We had, in some parts of the country, some poor range and forage resources, and that higher percentage of lightweight cattle really is going to keep that cattle on feed number higher longer and lead us to maybe not see contraction coming as fast as it will hit when we reach that point. The other thing that we need to pay attention to, in addition to beef cow slaughter, that's keeping this supply tight, is we're slaughtering and placing on feed a high percentage of heifers. We are not retaining females right now. In this high input situation with drought and poor resources, that the cow herds of the US are not holding heifers back. They're placing them on feed. It used to be that we thought heifers were a lot more inefficient than steers. We've got a lot better at feeding heifers, and I think that's part of it. But 40% of total cattle on feed being heifers is an extremely high number. And I believe that's probably an all-time high. We're seeing that come through on the slaughter side as well. Again, heifer slaughter, astronomical levels, almost 210,000 heifers a week going into the slaughter system, as opposed to about 175, 185,000 normal. Steer slaughter is lower, which is interesting when you think about heifers being a higher percentage. We're not retaining heifers. The other thing is, for the steer number to be lower, we're not taking a smaller percentage of steers. It just means that we have less animals out there if we're having a lower percentage, a lower number of steers. And I think we saw that decline a little bit in 21. We're seeing more decline in 22. And that slaughter story, because of high feed resources and because of drought, we need to pay a close attention to how that supply hits the packing system. The other thing we talk about in supply, especially in the state of Idaho, is the trend of using beef bulls on dairy cows. This is a chart from Cattle Facts, used some data from semen sales. If we look at the last few years, we've seen extreme high adoption in dairymen using beef semen when they're not trying to make replacements. The reason for that is they're gaining as much as an additional $100 per animal on those calves. They have better feeding performance, better carcass yields, better quality grades, have beef program eligibility, seeing less liver condemnation. Really across the board, the beef on dairy system is here to stay. It makes sense for dairymen. It makes sense for those selling beef semen. The dairy cow inventory is fairly stable. And if we get to about 80% of the dairy industry utilizing that beef on dairy cross, Cattle Facts expects that we'd see about 5 million head of those dairy cross calves entering the beef system annually. And I think that's something that we just need to expect on the supply side, is that we'll probably reach that point and then we won't be able to grow anymore. As you look at the dairy cow inventory, total US inventory of just shy of 9.5 million head, that's been relatively stable clear back until 2017. There's not a huge expectation that that grows, not a huge expectation that declines. That beef on dairy cross is going to have a stable supply of additional beef cows into our system. The other place we're seeing some of our cattle go, we'll talk about exports a little bit. We'll talk about the demand side of this more here in a minute. We're seeing some of our production obviously leave the country. And here is the LMIC update through 22, but also includes the 23-24 projection, which is lower. We'll talk about that on the demand side. But we have seen increased exports. We're pushing more and more production out of the US to other places, which is helping both hold prices higher. But as we see contraction, it makes US supplies tight again. On the other side of supply, we are, with a strong US dollar and extremely high-pocketed consumers, seeing a lot of imports. And we expect that to increase a lot in 23 and a lot in 24, especially from South American countries, as we are a market to sell higher priced beef. And as US beef becomes at more and more of a premium, we're going to really test how much that consumer wants higher priced products, wants that premium product that the US produces. When we think about the full storage, the last piece on supply is cold storage. In general, we see beef in cold storage dip in May, June, July, September. It's happened in 21. It happened across the average. It didn't happen in 2022. What we think maybe this is some speculation of contraction and trying to keep enough supply on hand. If it's any story other than that, this is a bearish sign of inability to move that product out of cold storage, inability to sell it. So what'll be interesting to watch is, as we normally see an uptick in beef on cold storage moving through September to the end of the year, if we continue to flatline, then that gives me some confidence that we are keeping beef on cold storage speculatively. If that's not the case and we see cold storage continue to increase, then maybe we have something to talk about on the demand side, which, as we dig into the demand side, CPI adjusted, in terms of dollars spent, we are at the highest retail all fresh beef demand that we've seen in a very long time. On a per capita basis, we have less beef being consumed per person in the US now than we did 30 years ago, but much better than we were doing during the peak of the last contraction, where beef got very expensive. And due to a variety of factors, including high price beef, we're expecting to see a further reduction in per capita beef consumption moving into 23 and 24. Why is that? We talk a little bit about domestic US consumer sentiment being at lower levels than even in the 2008 recession. We talk about the fact that we have had flat or negative GDP for the last 3 quarters. Talk about possibility of a recession. I think consumers are nervous about what that looks like. We talk about inflation, looking at all items. So the 12 months ended in October of 22, we were at 7.7% inflation on all items, 11% food inflation, 18% energy inflation. Really seeing some higher prices across all sectors. And we know that at times last year, this was even up higher percentage than that. And I would expect that we don't see inflation fall off, even with higher interest rates. We talked at the end of yesterday that the Federal Reserve was expecting another announcement. Sure enough, as expected, they increased the federal funds rate by an additional 50 basis points, or 0.5%. I don't know that we're going to see a huge slowdown in that. I think they will eventually pause, but they're signaling to us that inflation is still a problem. When we combine that story of high inflation, high spend with the personal savings rate, or the percentage of dollars that the average consumer is able to keep back in savings, we are currently at about 2.3%, which is lower than any level in the last decade, lower than any point during the '08 recession. And we really are not having a lot of dollars kept in consumers' pockets. We're seeing higher credit card balances. We do have some signs here that as we talk about a high price commodity like beef, a commodity that we're expecting to see an average of $9 a pound at the grocery store next year, which is an extremely high price for a product that has to compete with other proteins. Granted, other proteins are also high, so that's a positive factor for beef. But as a whole, general red meat consumption is expected to be down, marginally, but down due to high costs, low savings, and consumers having to pick and choose. I know that's real rosy when we talk about the demand side, and I do think there is a lot of opportunity and potential for beef. Beef is a good product. We do a good job in the US of making that premium. The price outlook and the price side is largely going to be driven by the supply side of this story. We talked about just how tight supplies are. We talked about drought. We talked about contraction. If we look at the expectation moving forward for average annual cattle prices, this dark blue line is looking at a 5 to 6 weight steer, red line a 7 to 8 weight steer, and the light blue line there, fed steers. Looking right now at a 5 to 6 weight steer calf nationally at around $1.80 to $2 a hundredweight. I have heard sales from video auction and private sales in the Northwest already seeing as high as $2.25 to $2.30 a hundredweight for a 5.5 weight calf. That's astronomical, and if that's the baseline before we've even really hit contraction, we can see that price run quite a bit higher. The expectation moving into 23 and 24, which is really the peak point of that contraction where we hit the bottom of our production. LMIC is expecting somewhere around $2.25 to $2.50 on a price per hundredweight for a steer calf. Depending on just how tight supplies get, we could even see something higher than that. 7 to 8 weight feeder steer, we're seeing expecting somewhere around that $1.60 to $1.70 a hundredweight right now, moving into upwards of $200 a hundredweight by the end of 24, where we really hit that low point. Fed steers currently sitting around that 125 to 135. Expect that we could get as high as 160, 175, even 180 a hundredweight on a fed steer by the time we hit the real low part of this supply issue. That translates also into expectations for bred females. Cattle Facts is expecting that in 2023, we're going to see a $2,100 average for the price of a bred cow. The rule of thumb I've always been taught is that for a run-of-the-mill commercial bred cow, you can take 1.5 times the price of a 5.5 weight calf. That means if we have a 225 a hundredweight for a steer calf at 550 pounds, that calf's going to be worth a little over $1,200, and that cow will be worth around $1,850. If you backtrack that rule of thumb, we're expecting maybe even a little higher than that 2.25 steer price going into next fall, which would be great news for cattle producers, especially with high input prices. That is a point that hopefully is above break evens, and in contraction often see some really high margins for cow-calf producers. So we hope that story continues this year. Something else driving the prices as we look at fed slaughter capacity utilization, we see that in 2020 and COVID, we had very little capacity for slaughter in the US. We had labor issues, we had plants that were down at times. That gave a lot of leverage to the packer. And so we had a lot of things in the news, people talking about too much leverage, talking about not enough dollars going back to that cow-calf producer. Well, we are seeing an increase in capacity. We got back on track some in 21. We're about back to normal pre-COVID levels in 22. And we've added some additional plants coming online, in addition to one of those being True West Beef down there in Jerome, which I, for one, am very excited about, that improve our capacity. And as those packers are fighting over the same cattle in the system, we have more leverage on the cow-calf production side. So that's an exciting thing to think about for the production side of the industry. As you look at that leverage piece in a different way, fed cattle prices as a percent of the beef cutout got to an all-time low in 2020, 2021, where 60% of that fed cow price, fed steer price was going to packers, 40% back to the producer or the production side. We're expecting that to improve in 22 and expecting that to stay improved and further improve 23 moving forward with that additional capacity and with leverage returning to the production side. We talk about cow-calf returns, look at that graphically. We had some astronomical returns the last time we were in a contraction period as the cattle inventory got down to a low there in 2014. Cow-calf returns on average nationwide were well over $500 a calf or per cow. And we were seeing not as great a margins these last few years. We had quite a bit of supply, 2018, 19, 20, even 21. We had some odds and ends supply disruptions. We've had really high input prices. Even with that, the 2022 expectation, that last chart here, is that cow-calf should be a profitable business model. And if we see something similar to what we saw in 2013, 14, 15, here in 22, 23, 24, with that contraction, we can see very high per cow returns. It could be tough to act on it if we have a heavy drought situation. The Livestock Marketing Information Center really is looking at 2025 for when that cattle cycle starts to turn over. And so 23, but really 2024 are the years that we expect cow-calf returns to be quite high, which is good when you look at estimated average cow-calf costs. So this is looking at total cash cost plus pasture rent. Has been in around $800 to $900 in the last, almost 10 years, 7-8 years, leading back to 2015 and earlier. As we look into 22 and 23, we're expecting the per cow costs on a cow-calf operation to be well above $1,000 a cow. And that's something to plan for, especially as we talk about more expensive money. If you're not operating on cash, interest expense has doubled, is expected to double or more going into 22, 23. If input prices continue to go higher, if drought worsens, if inflation worsens, we can see that cost piece really increase. We didn't see that go crazy in 2013, 14, 15. We are going to see costs rise with gross receipts this time. So margins will be a little bit different than that. And also talking about the feeder side of this, yes, there are high input prices that absolutely expects cattle feeders. I personally would expect that feedlots will encourage producers to retain ownership, try to feed less owned cattle in the very short term. However, as we get into this tight supply and very strong fed cattle prices, that will change. I think there's some good opportunity for retained ownership as we move, especially into that 24 period. It will depend on demand. It will depend on our ability to keep that market moving strongly, and it'll depend on this overall strength of fed cattle prices and how well they keep up. We talked about a lot of lightweight cattle being on feed and being on feed longer, and that impacts the delay period in which those feeders are going to want to accept those calves or how much they're willing to pay for them. Average returns to cattle feeders should have been more profitable than not. A lot more years on the grain side recently. If you go back and just thinking about similar periods and talking about contraction in the front part of 2013, moving into 14, as we're seeing those lightweight cattle get on feed and have to be there longer, we had some negative margins for cattle feeders, but going into the back half and through really the low point in production, very high margins for cattle feeders. And again, so during that back half, very large opportunities for retained ownership as well. In summary, I know I mentioned it one or two times, but contraction has begun. There will be a smaller impact in 2023. I think really the full impact of contraction and smaller cow herd numbers in 2024. Higher calf prices immediately. We're already seeing that. I think higher female prices later as people get those grass resources back. We get a little bit more wet weather and people have a place to put them. Packer leverage should be reduced as we move forward, largely because of that one, increased capacity, and two, less animals for that same system to fight over. Inflation's not done. Plan for higher input costs, plan for higher break-evens. If you haven't done so, it is a really good exercise to sit down around the start of the year and go through what you expect. If you can, try to tie up some of those inputs, try to tie up some feed. Largely, if you need hay, you're expecting to feed hay. If you need grain, expecting to feed grain. It is important to start having those conversations and tie up that supply sooner than later. And I really think on the demand side, the elasticity, how much we're willing to buy the same amount of beef at higher prices is going to be tested like never before. We talk about demand on the export side. I didn't really elaborate, but we've had a lot of our increased exports to China. Well, China's in absolute turmoil. They've overestimated their population by 100 million people and just came out with that. They're only having 0.7 people born per person in their country. You need at least 2.1 to have a healthy growing population. I think we're going to see that not be as good of an export market as we thought. I think some other countries are also becoming efficient with beef and have cheaper beef. The export side of demand may help keep our domestic prices lower. We shall see. And obviously, we talk about China, we can talk about Russia, Ukraine, and the possibility of large geopolitical issues going forward. That'll probably play a factor, impacting beef less than some other commodities, especially grains, but it all has a ripple effect and it will be something to pay attention to. And the last thing is there is really great potential for large profits. Don't forget the lessons of 2014 and 2015. We all know somebody who got caught on the backside of that who's no longer here and operational as a result of over leveraging to take advantage of contraction. It is a short window. Please take that into consideration as you make your management decisions moving forward and understand that some things are not the same. We have higher input costs, we have much higher interest expense, and leveraging yourself to take advantage may or may not be a good strategy. I'll leave that up to you, but I would take a close look at what happened and talk to some neighbors if you're new in the business. 2014, 2015, I think tells us a lot of things about what we're about to see in the next 2 years. With that, I will take any questions.